We've got another fresh business problem for Rocketblock's experts to solve in today's mock interview. Today's question is a classic: go or no go, as a company debates whether or not to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in a big new project. As a reminder, if you want to learn how to answer strategic questions like this for real, you have to be practicing actively and deliberately. At the very least, pause this video each time Tessa asks a question to try your own answer out loud. And when you're ready to get serious and learn how companies solve problems like this every day, come to Rocketblocks to build your structured thinking and analytical skills. Good luck and have fun casing.
So in this case, your client is LumaCell, a global manufacturer of lithium-ion battery cells. The company is facing a major $600 million investment decision and has hired your firm to help decide if this is a go or no-go. As context, the firm supplies batteries to leading electric vehicle companies like Ford and Rivian. With demand surging, LumaCell is facing production constraints at its North American factory, where output is capped by limited access to raw lithium. LumaCell is evaluating a proposal to build a new $600 million facility in Salta, Argentina, near some of the world's largest lithium reserves. They want your help evaluating whether this investment is attractive. How would you approach this decision?
Okay, so just want to make sure I've got this all right. LumaCell is considering building a lithium battery factory in Argentina near some of the mines in Salta. And this factory would be $600 million. Is that correct?
Exactly, you got it.
Great. And then what's their goal with this? My assumption is that they're getting closer to the raw materials, and that's why they would be considering Argentina. Is there any other goals that they're looking to do other than getting closer to their suppliers?
Yeah, so getting closer to the suppliers, and the other one sort of mentioned, is to just increase the supply of battery cells. There is more demand than they are able to supply. But the other reason why Argentina specifically, you mentioned a little bit about just being close to the lithium mines, and then the other reason is just access to more reasonable labor.
Oh, okay. That was going to be my next question about why Argentina. That's really helpful. And then, how big of an investment would it be? I know it's a $600 million decision. Is this all going to the factory? I'm just trying to understand kind of how that $600 million might be split up, and if it's all happening at once. And then kind of how does that compare to maybe what cash on hand they have?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you've mentioned that the total capital required is the 600 million. However, their initial investment, which will just cover land acquisition, permitting, early construction, and first phase operations, is estimated about 180 to 200 million USD. And this is definitely a large project for LumaCell. It would make it the largest upfront capital project in their history. So it's a big one. And then to put those numbers in context a little bit for you, last year the company generated $650 million in revenue and now has $95 million in cash on hand, meaning that the project would require external financing, staged deployment, or both, because they don't have enough money in the bank.
Okay. Well, that's really helpful. I think I have all I need right now. Do you mind giving me a moment just to go ahead and create a framework?
Of course.
Okay, I think I have all I need. So I'm thinking about this, that there's three really things that we need to look into. The first one is going to be a financial analysis. Seeing as that this is a go, no go, I'm trying to get through that initial gate and figure out on paper, do the finances make sense? Then second would be operational fit. So are we going to, the paper decision about math, now the on paper operations, what do those look like? How does that differ from what we've been doing? And then finally, the strategic fit. How does this align with what our goals are today and maybe 5 years and 10 years from us down the road? Because this is a large investment. So jumping more into the financials, I need to look at the unit economics. So what does it look like on a per battery basis today versus if we are building this factory in Argentina? So revenue per unit, cost per unit. I think with that, we want to be looking at raw material costs, labor costs, shipping and distribution. There's going to be a big shift here because we're now in a new global trade order, if you will. And so this might be cheaper to make the batteries, but more expensive on the back end due to tariffs. I also want to look at the investment costs here. We only have $95 million on hand. We're going to need a rainy day fund. Plus, this is a $600 million decision. So we're going to be raising quite a bit of money. What do the financing costs look like? And then finally, we want to get to an ROI. Big decision. We want to make sure that we're very confident in this ROI and not just that we're going over our internal hurdle rate, but that we are going way over just because we need to build in some risk modeling. So I'd also build that in. As far as operations, I want to think about kind of the key steps to a plant. So thinking about our throughput, what's the overall capacity? Is this going to be scalable? I know new manufacturing facilities, you want to build them oftentimes in a modular sense so that you can, as technology changes, you're not locked into something. Batteries are something or an industry right now that is seeing a ton of investment, both for automobiles and just for the globe and kind of across the globe. So really, really important that we're building this in the sense that we can kind of change the factory as the technology improves. Then I want to look at kind of what's our ability for this capacity to reduce our current constraints. That's one of our goals is to, increase our throughput. And then finally, I want to think about supply chain and labor considerations in Argentina. It is one of the more stable countries and from a geopolitical sense in South America, but they have undergone kind of a big political shift in recent years. And how do we think about that? And then finally, let's talk about the strategic fit. So we are accomplishing one goal by getting closer to our suppliers, but we're also changing this where we're getting further away from most of our manufacturing customers. We mentioned Ford and Rivian. Most of those are being manufactured in the US. So how does that strategically fit? Want to think about that. So that's where we are. I'd like to first start in terms of the financials and kind of look at that on paper.
Got it. Okay. Thanks so much.
Here's some feedback from Tessa. Matty does not rehash the entire prompt as he begins his response. He has one quick questions on the context that was given and then dives into discovering and clarifying questions to help inform his structure. It's clear Matty has a path in mind as he's asking questions. Rather than just, is there a goal for the case, he proposes a hypothesis for what the goal might be while asking the question. Matty shares information in his framework that is well structured and includes flashes of business acumen. He also does a good job here to identify financials as a priority. There is an opportunity to further identify which drivers, especially in operational fit, would be most important.
I think there's actually another bucket that you mentioned that I think it makes sense to start with, which is really, you mentioned a little bit about sort of the operational capacity of this type of facility. And I think that's just important before we get to the financials to really understand what is the capacity of the factory so that we can, model the number of units that we're able to produce. So along those lines, paramount to any manufacturing investment decision is an understanding of the facility's overall capacity. How would you think about calculating the capacity of a project such as this one?
Okay. Do you mind giving me a second just to organize my thoughts?
Sure.
Okay, so in my mind, there's three main steps to this. We're starting at the very beginning, which is going to be mining and raw material procurement, and then manufacturing process, and then kind of the finished product distribution. So before it's a battery, turning it into a battery, and then once it's a battery, how do we get it to the customer? So in terms of raw material, the overall limiting factor is how much lithium is there available and how much lithium is being taken out of the ground. So, are we taking, let's just talk in round numbers, 100 pounds of lithium out of the ground every day, and what's in store? So that's going to be the first thing we need to figure out. And then from that mining, how much of that raw material do we have access to, and how much of that raw material can we get in the door at our facility? Next, moving on to manufacturing. So I know that there's going to be refining. You're going to need to manufacture cathodes and anodes. Then there's going to be cell assembly. And then finally, you're going to be taking those cells and creating battery packs. So what do all of those processes look like? Whichever one's going to be the slowest is going to be, our bottleneck across this process. I also want to think about downtime, labor. Are employees working around the clock? Are we doing like 3 8-hour shifts? Are we doing, 2 10s with 4 hours of downtime for maintenance? How are we thinking about this? And even what's the layout of the facility so that we're, making this as smooth of a process as we possibly can. And that's manufacturing. Moving on to the finished product and distribution segment. So with batteries, really important that you're testing them. So we're going to need a testing. Also, storage is going to be important. You're going to want to keep batteries at the right temperature. You don't want them exposed to super high heat, super cold temperatures, because that can kind of impact the life of them, especially if you get swelling in a battery. And then we're going to need to think about shipping. The mining region of Argentina is fairly remote. So what sort of roads do we have to this proposed facility? How are we shipping these? So that's something that we're going to need to think about, because again, that can be a bottleneck as well. If we're making 100 batteries a day, but we can only ship out 90, we're going to need a lot of warehouse capacity to start building that up. So that's kind of the different steps I'm thinking of.
That's awesome. It seems like you know a lot about sort of this industry and this manufacturing process, which is great. Before we get into actually understanding what each of those numbers are, I'm wondering, one of the things you mentioned during your framework, which I'm super curious to hear more about, is you mentioned a little bit about looking at the US operations that we currently have and then looking at the Argentina operations that we're thinking about setting up. What type of differences, if you think about those steps, those capacity steps that you mentioned, or within each of the steps when you were breaking down sort of how you would get to the calculation, do you have any ideas or just kind of assumptions that you might make on where you would first look or where you might assume there would be the biggest differences from the North American facility?
Well, seeing as we are trying to get closer to the raw materials, that feels like the biggest difference. So if we think about today, and just to confirm, are we manufacturing in the United States today?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So we're importing all of this lithium. And so I'm thinking about the last 5 years, we had COVID, where ports shut down. In the last 6 months, we've had tariffs come on and off and on and off. So I know that some ships have been sitting in ports. And so the biggest issue there is there's probably been some ships with raw lithium that have just been sitting either at port or at sea, or containers sitting, on a truck somewhere. And so that to me feels like it's probably the biggest difference in terms of the US versus Argentina.
Super cool. Great. Thank you.
Here's some feedback from Tessa. Matty does well to come up with a structure here when asked to do some brainstorming. His structure is pretty straightforward and accessible, and doesn't require a ton of specific business acumen to be able to answer the question. From this simple structure, Matty does a good job to highlight his business acumen. You're not always guaranteed to get a case in a question where you're an expert, but if you do, it's a chance to show off your domain expertise. Importantly, Matty uses the details to support a simple, accessible structure. A common mistake is for people who are so familiar with an industry that they have a hard time communicating concepts well to people who are outside of the space. Matty does a good job of having his problem-solving and communication serve as a foundation for his business knowledge.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen now to a little bit of a more detailed breakdown of the process itself. I think it pretty closely mirrors what you laid out, but maybe just take a minute to understand the differences between what you expected and what the true process looks like.
Okay, great. So I've got 4 steps here. I think some of these are sort of the sub steps of the 3 big buckets I talked about. So refining would have fallen into that raw material manufacturing, electrode manufacturing, assembly, and then packaging is going to be sort of a final step. So what I'm thinking I'm going to do here, I see that we've got 2 or 3 bullets for each of these steps. And that there's a note that 1 million kilowatt hours is 1 gigawatt hour. I work in energy, but I still forget these. So thank you very much. That's helpful. And then assume that the plant operates 50 weeks a year, 2 weeks for downtime, holidays, super important. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to calculate what the gigawatt hours is. So I get one consistent number across these. And whatever is the limiting factor here, I'll know is our capacity for the factory. Does that sound like the right approach with you?
That sounds great.
Okay. So starting with lithium refining, I have 600 tons per day. The factory's operating 5 days per week. So 600 times 5 times 100. So I'm going to do 600 times 500. And then it's operating 50 weeks per year. So I have 600 times 500, 3. That's going to be 30,000 times 50 weeks per year. Times 100 kilowatt hours per ton. And so I'm going to get, that is going to be 15 gigawatt hours per year. Okay, so that's sort of our initial mark as the start. Let's look at electrode manufacturing. So it's 0.075 gigawatt hours per day times that 5 days a week times 50 weeks per year.
Mm-hmm.
So I add 0.75 times 5 gives me 0.375 times 50. So I get 18.75 gigawatt hours per year. So raw materials is still going to be our bottleneck there.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on to cell assembly, 0.12 gigawatt hours a day times, let's say, 250. So that's the 5 days a week times 2 weeks per year. So 0.12 times 250. That is going to be 30 gigawatt hours per year. That is a lot that we can assemble. And then moving on to the packaging. So we have 1,000 battery packs a day times the 250 for the days a week and weeks per year.
Mm-hmm.
And then 120 kilowatt hours per battery pack. Okay. So 1,000 times 250 times 120. I'm going to do this 33 million. Okay, 0. So I get 30 gigawatt hours a year. So our limit here is the lithium refining. So that is half of what we can assemble and what we can package in a year,
Mm-hmm.
which is interesting. So if we can increase our raw materials, then I would love to see that because we can end up increasing our manufacturing and throughput. The other place I would want to look is our electrode manufacturing. And I'm wondering if as we spend more time in the factory, we train the workforce, if we're able to get that. There's also upside there if we can increase the raw material because we're only operating 5 days per week. So we could end up pushing that to, electrode manufacturing to 7 days per week or even 6 days per week. And we still have some room to meet our assembly and packaging thresholds.
Awesome. That's great. That's a really good overview. So if you just think about the case overall, we still have more to go, but just wondering, like, what are your current thoughts? Where are we at if you think back to what you wanted to look at during your framework?
Yeah, I need to put, so I would want to compare what that raw material or what our throughput is compared to what our throughput is today. Do we have that information?
We don't have the information about
Okay.
what our throughput is today, no, but that's a good question.
Okay. Yeah, because that number is just sort of sitting there in a vacuum. It's not very helpful. So I'd want something to compare it to.
Hmm.
And then the next thing that I want to do is, okay, well, we have what our throughput is. How much money are we making relative? So what's our ROI? So probably want to start at like a per battery sold. I think it's a lot easier than going to a cell or a pack basis. And then figuring out kind of what is the potential ROI on this project.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Matty does well to explain the math that he wants to do before diving into the calculation. Matty looks to find easy middle steps in his multiplication. For example, if you're multiplying by 105, you can just call that 500. It's clear he's comfortable with the numbers and moving them around and manipulating them to get to his answer. Matty is consistently looking for the takeaway during this math exercise. He's always looking to see which step will be the rate limiter as he tries to explore what the answer is for the client.
You mentioned in terms of like what is the profit per cell or per battery.
Yep.
What else would you need to know in order to calculate that ROI? I think we know a couple of financial pieces already, but what else do you know?
So thinking about this, we know what the upfront cost, the capex for the plant is. So that's going to be 600 million. I'd want to understand what our costs are. So what does it cost to make a battery? I'm guessing we either have this on a per battery or maybe a kilowatt hour basis. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, we do.
How long is this factory? How long are we planning to run this factory? What's its lifespan?
Yep.
And then the sales price of a per battery. So do we have those pieces of information?
We have all of that, exactly. So the operating costs, so sort of the labor, logistics, the energy to actually run the plant, the lithium itself, that all combines to about $35 per kilowatt hour.
Okay.
And then the selling price is $60 per kilowatt hour.
Okay.
And the lifespan of the plant is 10 years. And then just as a reminder, the capex is 600 million.
Okay, great. So I've got those four numbers. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to calculate what the profit is for an annual basis and then a 10-year ROI. Does that sound like the right approach here?
Sounds perfect. Yeah.
Cool. I'll do that. Give me a second just to organize my thoughts if you don't mind.
Great.
Okay, so what I'm going to start with is I need to do the annual profit. So the annual profit is going to be the profit per unit times the number of units that we're making. And then once I do that, I'm going to multiply that over the 10 years to figure out what the profit is over 10 years. And then we'll back out what our original investment is to get to an ROI number. So if we're selling, our profit per unit is going to be 60 minus 35. So we're making $25 per unit. So just a little bit shy of a 50% profit margin on a per unit basis, which is pretty good. And then we are making 15 million units per year. So 15 times 25 is going to be 375 million. So our annual profit is $375 million.
Yep.
And so 375. So our total return over 10 years is going to be 375 times 10, so 3.75 billion. And then minus 0.6 billion or 600 million. So it's 3.15 billion is our total profit over 10 years, not really accounting for the time value of money, but that's okay. And then our ROI will be 3.15 billion. Let's just make that 3,150 million over 600 million. So we're using the same units. And that is going to be, 6 goes into it, 5. So that's going to be 5.25 or 525%.
Yep.
If you can make 525% in a 10-year kind of time frame, that's a great ROI.
Mm-hmm.
I would want to know both what the upside case is here and what our downside case is here. So we know that our limiting factor is this raw lithium procurement, or kind of on the raw lithium side. And our next limiting factor is on the cathode anode manufacturing, and that's about 20%. So our upside here, just if we focused on the raw material, would be about 20% higher. So somewhere in the 600 and some percent ROI. But I'd also want to think through kind of like what is our risk if we're only able to get, you know, 10 gigawatt hours of lithium equivalent, something like that. So thinking through that. But upon first glance, it's a pretty healthy ROI. I would want to talk about maybe some of our other considerations in terms of, how does this impact our relationship with the end customers, especially, with tariffs.
Here's some feedback from Tessa. Again, it's clear that Matty knows what kind of calculation he wants to do before diving into the numbers. When prompted by Tessa, he's able to describe the kinds of information he'd want to see to be able to execute on the calculation. Matty finishes off his calculation with a clear hypothesis on where the case is going. This is great to do and shows strong business acumen, even in an interviewer-led case.
Great. Yeah. It's almost like you're reading my mind here, because I actually did want to talk a little bit about the tariffs that are going on. So new legislation by the United States now proposes a 10% tariff on battery imports from non-US FTA countries. Argentina is included in this. So how might this development impact the project's ROI? And additionally, what mitigation strategies, if any, could LumaCell consider?
Okay. I want to think about this in two ways. I think the first is we need to figure out what the financial repercussions are here, and figure out the profitability. And then I want to think about how do we get out of this? How can we mitigate this? So first, if they were to absorb the tariffs, this would decrease revenue by about 10%. So our overall revenue would go from, rather than $60, we would go to about $54. And if we were to flow this through, then our annual profit would go from 375 to about 340. So, okay, so then I'm going to do 340 times 10. So 3.4 billion, back out the 600 million investment. So 2,080 million over 6. So what we'd end up getting is about 470% or so, which is lower than the 525, but it's still a really high ROI. If you're making over 4.5 times your money in 10 years, you're going to be pretty happy.
Yeah.
So lowers it, but it's not hit the panic button. So let's talk about mitigation strategies.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the first one would be a regulatory. So if this is a US company and we're selling to US companies, can we do some lobbying? I think recent history has shown that there are carve-outs available. I know the iPhone, Apple is investing a lot in the US to try to get a carve-out. So can you do a little bit of trading there? Then there's like an exemption application. So again, can we apply for that? In terms of another sort of idea, would be like, can we onshore some of these? So could we send the cells, and then the packs are created in the US? US labor is a lot more expensive. I would say it's going to be more than 10% more expensive. So I don't think that would really get to it, but it's something to consider.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, what our customers pay for it. Like, can we get them more batteries and they'll eat that 10%? So we get them 20% more batteries, but they pay that 10%. I think would be a trade-off. Again, the labor is going to be a lot more expensive in the US, so I think they'll still be better off overall here.
Yeah, I think that's a great consideration. It seems like the 10% isn't a make or break. I mean, I'll happily invest in something that'll get me 450% returns in 10 years. I don't know about you, but I think the bigger question that's coming to mind for me is, what is the more macro level impact of these tariffs? What is the more macro level risk? Is it something that we're just not that concerned about? It's 10%, it's not that bad. Could it be 90% next year? And that's something that is a bigger risk to us as an American company. If that was to happen and it becomes the financial case falls apart because of the tariffs, what other options do we have? Will the factory still be useful? What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, China is investing a ton in EV production, and that's a healthy enough market. I think it would be hard for us to penetrate a market in China, but I know EV penetration is significantly higher in Europe, so we could also look to other markets. I don't see EVs going away. I know that they're facing a little bit of headwinds in the United States right now, due to some of the subsidies and tax breaks being pulled away. But I don't think that this is overall a big enough macro risk. Um, Batteries can also be used for other things. So even if we're creating top class lithium-ion batteries, and it doesn't seem like there's going to be an opportunity to use these in US manufactured cars, there are other use cases for batteries. So I still think that this is a worthy investment.
Awesome.
One good tactic to do for risk analysis is to translate the impacts into dollars. It's not enough to just say, this bad thing could happen. You have to complete the exercise and spell out how bad the impact would be or could be should that situation arise. Similarly, another useful tactic in risk analysis is to imagine 2 to 4 possible future scenarios. If you know the financial impact of each scenario, you can assign a probability for each scenario as well. This exercise takes risk analysis from a world of unknowns to a place where you can make informed bets based on the weighted average probability and dollar value impact of different future paths.
Okay. The CFO is asking for your final recommendation. Should LumaCell proceed with the Argentina plant?
Okay. So yes, I believe that LumaCell absolutely should proceed with the Argentina plant. Looking at the numbers, the kind of base case scenario has a 525% ROI over a 10-year 10-year life of the factory. And even with the threat of the US tariffs of 10%, it still has about a 470% ROI. I believe that there's significant upside here, as we pointed out as well, that if we can increase the sourcing, we can push this into the 600% ROI or above. The risks here are going to be the tariffs, and kind of an unpredictable government and trade environment really across the globe right now. Our next step here, I believe, would be having conversations with the US government about trying to get a carve out or an exemption to avoid those tariffs.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Here's some feedback from Tessa. Maddie's first response here is super clear. Yes, they should proceed with the investment. Especially in a go or no-go case, you absolutely need to have a point of view on the right answer by the end of the case.
Hey everyone, it's Kenton Kavesky here, the founder of Rocketblocks. Thank you so much for watching this mock interview video. I hope you found it informative and helpful as you are getting ready to prepare for your own interviews and hopefully landing that job offer you are excited about. We have a ton of great content on the Rocketblocks channel coming out on a weekly basis, mock interviews, mini lessons, and chats with our Rocketblocks experts. So if you haven't subscribed yet already, please do so. There is a big red button below. And if you hit that, you'll get all of our content as soon as it comes out. Thanks for watching and have a great day.